Before any scientific discipline can predict behavior or dictate strategy, it has to organize raw observation, because you cannot derive predictive laws from absolute chaos. You first have to force all of that data into a structure. This starting point is what theorists call a classificational schema. These frameworks contain zero predictive power and no theoretical laws, but they are the mandatory first step for organizing phenomena into groups that researchers can actually study. One of the primary ways to build these frameworks is through deductive classification, or logical partitioning. Here, researchers start from above. They take a heterogeneous universe of data and impose a strict set of categorical properties to divide it up. This chart shows a hierarchical classification of wholesalers, partitioned by whether they take title to goods. This strict top-down logic sometimes generates empty classes, categories with no known phenomena. These theoretical blanks aren't failures. They prompt researchers to hunt for missing data. The alternative is classification from below, using inductive grouping procedures, like cluster analysis. Instead of imposing a framework, researchers analyze massive sets of data and let the natural clusters form the categories. Whichever method is used, the objective remains identical. To build a valid theory of marketing strategy, we have to partition the noise into epistemologically sound categories. Because researchers can divide a universe of data in an infinite number of ways, they have to evaluate the strength of their taxonomies. The ultimate criteria is usefulness. Does this schema help generate consistent, law-like statements? Many widely accepted frameworks fail this test of logical consistency. Take the traditional AMA classification, dividing products into convenience goods, shopping goods for careful comparison, and highly desired specialty items. This diagram illustrates the structural flaw. The AMA definition uses the property of purchase frequency to define convenience goods. But when it moves to defining specialty goods, it switches its criteria entirely, using search effort and willingness to travel instead. Shifting properties mid-framework ruins the structural integrity of the classification. To see a logically rigorous alternative, we can look at Louis Buckland's 1963 classification. This chart shows Buckland's schema. It divides all goods into mutually exclusive categories using a single, consistent property, the consumer's cognitive preference map. If the consumer has a preference map, they move down one path. If they don't, they move down another. When managers rely on logically flawed taxonomies, the strategies built upon them inherit those fractures. Rigorous partitioning is the mandatory first requirement for theoretical stability. Once the data is organized into sound categories, a discipline must divide its theoretical pursuits based on the purpose and structure of the research. The first branch is positive theory. This is the scientific pursuit of what is. Positive theories are built entirely on descriptive, law-like generalizations that explain why phenomena happen and predict what will occur in the real world. The second branch, shown here on the right, is normative theory. This is the pursuit of what ought to be. It prescribes the correct actions for decision-makers given specific objectives and states of nature. Here is the semantic trap. Purely normative structures contain zero law-like generalizations. Because they cannot scientifically explain phenomena, calling them theories is technically incorrect. They are simply decision models. Pointing out this structural difference does not downgrade the importance of strategy. Rather, it places strategy in its proper epistemological position. Confusing what a market actually is with what a manager ought to do fractures the planning process before it even begins. We can see this confusion clearly in the high-assay model for media scheduling, a well-known framework often mistakenly labeled as a theory. This diagram maps the high-assay model. Notice the imperative action verbs: cycle through all media, find lowest cost. Because these steps prescribe action rather than articulate market laws, the model cannot scientifically explain performance. It is a pure decision tool. This brings us to the golden rule of marketing science. Valid normative models must be constructed upon a solid foundation of positive theory. The architecture works in one direction. By understanding the deterministic laws of the market, how consumers actually behave, managers can then design strategies to manipulate those outcomes. Reliable rules for making a business perform better can only exist if testable laws first explain how the market actually functions. Building those positive, descriptive laws faces an immediate roadblock. human consumers are erratic and subjective, which raises the question of whether a true predictive science of markets is even possible. In the mid-20th century, theorist Frank Bass claimed that consumer behavior is inherently stochastic, or random. He argued that this randomness makes deterministic prediction at the individual level structurally impossible. We can track the variables, but cannot predict a single individual's exact purchasing path with absolute certainty. There are too many unobservable cognitive factors. Bass was correct at the micro level. We cannot apply strict deductive nomenological models, laws that guarantee a specific outcome every single time, to an individual shopper. If strategy restricts its view strictly to the micro-level individual, building a predictive deterministic science appears completely out of reach. Shelby Hunt offered a realist resolution to this stochastic roadblock. We have to shift the theoretical level of abstraction. This diagram illustrates the shift. Aggregating millions of unpredictable consumer decisions over a long timeline stabilizes localized chaos into clear, predictable patterns. This deductive statistical model establishes deterministic laws based on aggregate statistical states, rather than requiring individual guarantees. At this macro scale, system-level variables operate deterministically, predicting shifts in market share, the decay rates of brand loyalty, and exact speeds of technological diffusion. The behavior of a single consumer may be random, but marketing systems are mathematically deterministic at the aggregate level. A rigorous positive science of markets is undeniably real. Once positive laws are established, theorists often attempt to unify them. This raises a final structural question. What exact requirements elevate a standard positive theory to the apex of a general theory? A general theory must meet 4 strict criteria. It requires an encompassing scope that explains more phenomena, deep systematic integration of its concepts, the total incorporation of lesser, narrower theories, and a high level of abstraction. The Howard-Sheth theory of buyer behavior serves as an exemplar of hitting that required level of high abstraction. This diagram maps its architecture. The theory uses highly abstract inputs, like stimulus ambiguity and perceptual bias, that successfully apply across entirely distinct domains. The exact same inputs explain consumer retail purchases, industrial supply contracts, and institutional buying. A general theory represents the zenith of scientific rigor, taking fragmented, domain-specific laws and uniting them into a single, cohesive explanatory framework. But there is a fatal trap waiting at this summit of theory construction. Researcher William Wells famously warned academics to start small and stay real. The danger is runaway abstraction. This occurs when theoretical constructs become so highly elevated and detached from empirical reality that they dissolve into pure semantics. The absolute rule of science remains. A theory that cannot be empirically tested against real-world observations may be mathematically beautiful, but it is scientifically void. The architecture relies on every part of its structure. Researchers build rigorous taxonomies as the foundation, use those categories to frame positive laws, and finally construct normative strategic models for the interior. The architecture of strategic marketing only survives contact with the real world when every single level of its theory remains relentlessly anchored to testable empirical truth.